Thank you, Rachel. We are going to go to our next panel. A quick programming change. Unfortunately, due to some last-minute health issues, Rihanna Gunwright from New Consensus was not able to join us. But we are thrilled to have Emily Holden, Leah Stokes, and Jerry Taylor for our next panel. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Hi, everybody. I realized that we were the lunch panel right before lunch, and we also are in a dark room. So I'm going to not belabor too many points here from my point of view and launch into Leah and Jerry's discussion. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about a couple points for framing from a journalist's perspective. One of those, which is very obvious to all of us in this room, or probably all in this room for this reason, is that we already know that global temperatures have risen a degree Celsius, and we're on track for 3 degrees Celsius, which the science shows requires massive change to how people live all around the world. So at the same time that the science is showing that, our political system, beyond our political system, our capitalist economic system and our society, everything about the way that we operate prevents that kind of massive and quick change. And then we're faced with where the US population of voters stands on this. And so we know more people than ever are worried about climate change, concerned about it, want to see action on it. But at the same time, a recent poll from the Yale Climate Communications Group found that 48% of Democrats place doing something about climate change as a very high priority, and only 5% of Republicans. So that's still not a very high number in either of those categories, but particularly for Republicans. And the third thing that I would just note, because I see this conversation taking place throughout my work frequently, is a conversation that I had with a Democratic staffer recently about the Green New Deal, and in particular some of my coverage on it. And so I had a story that's, it was about the New Democrats proposal that they put out for, it was a list of about a dozen bills that they have, and what they would do instead of the Green New Deal, and what they think that they could start to do now or in the near future. And I think he rightfully pointed out that too often, the staffer did, too often this conversation is an either or. And that's not where we need to be to see progress on the climate crisis. So what he said was, if you try to do something right now, you have to acknowledge today's political realities, which means you're a total sellout. But tomorrow's political realities could be anything we imagine, so why would you not drop your hard work and your legislating pen and dare to dream big? This thinking runs through the discourse from political candidates, some not all, to advocacy groups, some not all, to activists, some not all, to average people following the issue, some not all. Stuff that would help and is achievable soon is not only not good enough, it's bad. So I think that's really what we're here to talk about today, and what Leah and Jerry can talk about in terms of what the role of the Green New Deal is, how achievable it could be, and whether it would be better for most Americans. So Leah, would you like to begin with your presentation?
Yeah, so I think we're each going to give some opening remarks and then have a conversation. Hi everybody, my name is Leah Stokes. I'm a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I have become very involved in all these things for bizarre reasons. So today I'm going to talk to you about the challenge that we see, and I'm going to draw on some of the primary candidates' policies, their plans on climate change. And that's because, at least in my mind, that's where the Green New Deal currently lives, not as much in a resolution as in the primary. And so this is the 2035 plan for electricity and transportation, the Inslee plan that Bracken Hendricks, who spoke last night, was very involved in writing, and is now also the Warren plan. And what it basically is really hard, which is to dramatically ramp up clean electricity by 2035. And you know, if you take the average deployment rate of renewables over the past decade and you make it about 0.6 percentage points annually, what this represents is something like a 16, 17% increase over historical deployment rates. If you take the best years that we've ever had, which were 2016 and 2017, where deployment was 1.2 percentage points, it's about 8%. 8 times historical deployment rates. So, you know, can we multiply renewables by a factor of 8? That's the question. And of course, you have to remember that my figure includes the years 2019, already in that one, and haven't deployed at a breakneck pace. And of course, the ITC and PTC are currently expiring, so yeah. This is the Bernie Sanders plan. And what I have done is delete nuclear, and many people get upset that I do that, but actually if you read the plan, that is what it says. It says 100% renewables by 2030. And by the way, why does it say 200? Does anybody know why it says 200%? Transportation, exactly, right? Electricity and transport. So we have to grow the grid in order to electrify the transportation sector. And so the scale of this is really massive. Now, of course, what you should be thinking is if we have energy efficiency, then maybe we don't have to grow it as much. But the Bernie Sanders plan is actually 50% harder on an annual basis than the Inslee or Warren plan. It is multiplying the best deployment we've ever had by a factor of 12. And if we take more of an average deployment, it's multiplying it by a factor of 25. So that's the challenge. And if you take the IPCC seriously and you really want to decarbonize quickly, I'm not saying we have to do it by 2030 or 2035, but that's what people are talking about. And I do not believe at all that a carbon tax alone will do that. I've spent the summer writing a review article for the Boston Review, which will come out, about the history of carbon pricing around the world with Matto Mildenberger, who is writing a whole book about the history of carbon pricing around the world. And the challenge is you can't get carbon prices high enough, and then you deal with huge issues of inelasticity on both the supply and demand side. And you can read that article when it comes out, but I just don't believe that carbon taxes are technology forcing or that they're very deployment forcing. They are mostly creating efficiencies on a carbon intensive system. If you look at the European Union emissions trading system, for example, it mostly led to fuel switching within fossil fuels and just efficiencies on the margin. Okay, so the idea of the Green New Deal, which I really love, is that we must have solutions at the scale of the crisis. It is not enough to, and this goes to sort of what Emily was saying, but we have historically thought that we could maybe do nothing or do something and that would be enough. But climate change is a problem. Yes, we can make everything better by degrees and every ton of carbon we don't emit is fabulous, but we actually do have to try to solve the problem or at least make massive headway, which according to the 1.5 degree report means cutting emissions by about half by 2030. And that's for the whole planet. So the US probably needs to do more than that. So the other challenge, which I wanted to talk about because Jerry and I had a debate about this already, that the people framing the Green New Deal really see is inequality as a big additional challenge. So if you read the Green New Deal resolution, it's about not just the climate crisis, but also the inequality crisis. So I just pulled up some figures about where we're at from income inequality in this country. So wage stagnation is a huge issue. Productivity has been going to corporations and not average workers in terms of their pay. And you can see this really dramatically in this figure. You can also see it here, which is that the level of concentration amongst wealthy people is at the levels of the Gilded Age. And, you know, I think it's easy in a room like this where we all, I would hypothesize, make above average money in the United States to forget that there are lots of poor people in this country who would really struggle to pay, well, already struggle to pay their energy bills, for example. And so that's kind of the hypothesis behind this thing. And I think it has some merit. So why are climate and inequality linked? This is something Jerry and I have debated, and I tried to lay out an argument for it. So first, carbon emissions are a function of wealth. We know that the wealthiest countries in the world emit more, the wealthiest people emit more. And so, you know, historically there are issues of equity and justice, both globally that we focus a lot on, but even within the United States about sort of who gets to profit off of fossil fuels and who has to pay for it. And there's amazing research that came out a few months ago which showed, for example, black and brown communities breathe in way more polluted air from goods that they don't even consume. So people are consuming the benefits of a fossil fuel economy but not really paying for its costs. And you can see that in air quality, you can see it in climate change. Climate denial and delay, we were just talking about this, Jerry and I, have been pushed by billionaires and very wealthy corporations to maintain their ability to extract fossil fuels. And I literally view this as money in the ground, that the longer you can wait, the more money you can make. And we were just talking about the Chris Hayes article from a few years ago in The Nation, which talks about sort of fossil fuels and compares it to abolitionism. As I've already mentioned, people's ability to pay for energy costs is quite unclear. So the very radical left-wing group called the U.S. Energy Information Administration had a report last year under the Trump administration that 1 in 3 Americans struggle to pay their energy bills. So when we talk about a $50 ton carbon tax, I've done the calculations, and that's about $25 a month more for driving for the average American. And you know, that doesn't, $25, all of us in this room could probably pay that, but a lot of Americans can't pay that because they're making very little money and they need to get around. And that's also why I feel like a carbon tax, which just makes things more expensive but doesn't provide actual solutions to people, whether that's through like public transit investment or electric vehicle subsidies or whatever it is, like just makes it harder to do things without making the solutions easier. And I think Brack and Hendricks did a wonderful job last night talking about sort of the big transformational challenge we have ahead of us. This is a distributive issue, right? If we're going to rebuild the economy, we have to ask ourselves, who are we rebuilding it for? Who benefits? Who gets jobs? Who gets the harms, right? Whose backyards will these things be going through? And it's interesting because actually I don't think that nuclear historically has been cited in communities of color. Like the data on that is not that clear. But there's definitely a perception within the environmental justice movement that that's the case. And so there's a lot of fear, for example, about new nuclear, about nuclear waste. With the exception of some indigenous communities who have been, you know, within uranium mining and have faced serious impacts from that. But more generally, I think there's questions about what are we going to build and in what communities, and a lot of fear around that. So if you even bring up negative emissions technologies like direct air capture, I mean, there's fear about where those things go. And I don't think that fear is justified, but I think it speaks to a long history of environmental racism in this country and really unequal benefits and unequal harms from the way that we have produced energy historically. So now I will try to make the case that doing this in this crazy, radical way of packaging social and economic policy together is more popular. So I have been writing a paper, it's under review at a journal with 2 colleagues, Matto Mildenberger and Parrish Bergquist. And what we show in this paper, and we did it like totally honestly, we're boring researchers who just try to find stuff out about the world and then try to publish it, which takes a while, is actually that putting climate and social policy together would be more popular. And the way we show this is through what's called a conjoint experiment, which basically gives people like, would you like this package of a policy or this one? And then they pick between them. And what we find is that adding things like a job guarantee polls very well. I mean, that's not like just me, it just does. And I'm not saying I'm into a job guarantee, I'm just saying it polls well. $15 minimum wage, very popular policy because people are living in poverty and not being paid living wages in this country. Housing programs, retraining programs and union jobs, and even the very radical lefty notion of free public tuition. So I think the thing is that a lot of the way we talked about climate policy historically with the Waxman-Markey bill or even with state-level cap-and-trade efforts, it's like cost first, right? It's like, you're going to pay for things, and yeah, get in on this. And the Citizens Climate Lobby, working on Theda Skocpol's white paper that she wrote after the failure of Waxman-Markey, sort of said, well, we'll just pay everybody a dividend. But I think actually that twisting climate policy to be about benefits first is the idea of the Green New Deal. And now what those benefits are, we can totally debate, and I'm not saying these are all my wish list. And I take Jerry's critique that they are the wish list of some parties on the left. But I do feel that putting benefits in a bill is useful. Now, of course, we also find that a bipartisan package is more popular, and these things might be mutually exclusive, these two factors. We also find, of course, that effects are sensitive to costs. Now, the interesting thing is they're more sensitive to cost on the household level than they are on the sort of spending government level. And that makes sense, right? Because if you tell people we're going to spend like $100 billion or $300 billion, what does that mean? They don't really know. And I think that also speaks to sort of where the costs are born. Are we bearing them in terms of deployment from like a massive DOE push? Are we bearing them in terms of a carbon tax being pushed onto consumers? Unlike what Emily said at the beginning, we actually do find that Americans are selecting vote choice based on environment. And this is actually a pretty common finding. I wouldn't say it's very important for everybody. You can see it's about 50%. But it's somewhat important or slightly important for 83% of Americans. And in general, what we see in public opinion trends is that whenever you have a Republican in office who's pretty anti-environment, the public surges in terms of its concern about the environment. So right now, this is definitely something that Trump is on the wrong side of from a public opinion perspective. This is polling from the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, which I'm affiliated with. And it's just amazing, the data that they are showing. Across the board, they do long-term trends. You know, basically, you can think about 10-plus points on all their kinds of issues in the past year or two. So climate change is obviously rising in interest and concern. And I just want to talk about the fact that we had the world's largest mobilization in history on Friday. This is, you know, inspired by Greta Thunberg. And that really should not be discounted. And that's something that Jerry and I have also sort of talked about, like, how big can the social movement get? How critical will it be to the story? And I personally think that it's going to get big. Now, I'm just going to do a little preview, and then Jerry can pick up whatever threads he likes. So Jerry wrote an 11,000-word article. I wrote a 30-point tweet thread in response. Both were very long, and I don't know why anybody read either, but a lot of people read both, funny enough. And so I tried to, in a fair way, summarize the ways that we disagreed, or the places. So coalitions. The Taylor and Stokes debate, yes. Coalitions. So are income inequality and climate linked? I tried to make a case for that. You could make another case. Will union support matter to building a big coalition? If we're thinking about this as an outside social movement game, how do unions play into that? Obviously, big tensions, and we were talking about that this morning, and Bracken talked about that a bit yesterday. How about the media? Is the media doing a good job communicating this crisis? Therefore, people feel it's in their lived daily lives. I think historically they've been doing a bad job, but in the last year or two, obviously right now it's like Covering Climate Now, this big initiative in the media to get this out there, trying to get more attribution science into the media. So it's getting better. And then I think actually the generational piece we could have a disagreement about. I think there are huge differences between how younger people and older people feel about this issue, and you even see that in the polling with young Republicans. So young Republicans are becoming very concerned about these issues, and it's less polarized amongst younger people. Scale. So what is the scale and the cost of the problem? I tried to show you that I think this is like a huge, really big problem and that we need to therefore spend a lot of money on it. And so the metaphor that the Green New Dealers have picked up is war. Now, of course, there is no war. So, I mean, it's like war on invisible gases. It's kind of a hard war. But, you know, how do we think about what's justified in terms of government spending and what we're capable of doing if we take on industrial or like wartime mobilization? And then political strategy is, I think, where we have different thoughts as well. So the Senate is a thing. It's problematic. The role of social movements in terms of playing a big outside game and like in a Roosevelt way, make me do it. How much of this is about insider politics, like what we saw with EDF and Waxman-Markey, versus outsider politics, like what the Discotchable said was the reason why Waxman-Markey failed. And then we were just talking about this earlier, but what is the role of primary and climate laggards? So personally, I think that threatening Democrats and Republicans who are offside on this issue can be a really promising way forward, because it's what the right has been doing to drive denial and polarization in the opposite direction. So those are my slides, and if you are interested in my very boring research, I have a book coming out in March, which is all about these kinds of debates happening at the state level, primarily with renewable portfolio standards and net metering policies. Bit of a different thing, but still relevant. So thanks so much, and now we'll let Jerry respond.
I prefer to sit. Can you hear me with the microphone? All right. I don't have any PowerPoints because I've long believed that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, so I'll put that aside. I totally agree with Leah and the Green New Deal activists and people at Sunrise and people on the progressive left about the urgency of the climate crisis, the need to respond ambitiously and aggressively, and as such, as ambitiously as politically possible. I don't have any disagreements with the objective of Green New Dealery, as it were. But I have profound disagreements with the idea of the Green New Deal as a political vehicle to get there. I've been asked to give 5 or 7 minutes. I'll try my best. Like Leah, I can go on and on forever, and you'll get to hear some of that. While I have many complaints about the Green New Deal, in 5 to 7 minutes I have to pick one. So this is not to deny nor disparage other disagreements I've offered on the Green New Deal that you can find in my 11,000-word Castro encyclical on the Niskanen website. The fundamental problem that I have with the Green New Deal as a political project is that there may very well be, it is not certain, but there may very well be a political window of opportunity that opens for climate action in the 117th Congress in 2021. If the Democrats win the White House, which is not certain, if they hold the House, I think that's a little bit more certain, and whether they get the Senate or not, helpful to get the Senate, but I think a window of opportunity could occur even with Republican control of the Senate. That window is going to open. One thing we know about windows of opportunity is that they don't stay open for very long. You can't force them open. It requires a confluence of political considerations and things that are going on in the policy community. They don't predictably open. They generally don't open very long. And successful policy change occurs when there is a vehicle that can move quickly through that window before it closes. And the Green New Deal is not that vehicle. The Green New Deal couldn't even pass a vote of the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives. In other words, if there was a Republican rapture experience and they all disappeared and all we had were Democrats in the House, it still wouldn't pass, which I think tells you a lot. Nor was a single member of the Senate willing to put their name on that resolution. That tells me that whatever the merits of the Green New Deal approach may be, and again, for the purposes of my introductory remarks, I'll put that aside, it's a package that is not relevant towards the next window of political opportunity. And my complaint is that, at least up until recently, the Green New Deal has been sucking up so much political oxygen in the room that it's gotten in the way of the important productive work that needs to be done right now if climate activists are going to take advantage of that window in 2021. Because here's what happens if you don't do your work while you're in the wilderness to prepare for that vehicle to move through. We can see it in the healthcare debate beautifully. It is a cautionary tale that every activist should understand. Now let's roll back the clock. Healthcare has been with us as a political issue for the better part of a century. To bring you into more modern times, a window of opportunity actually opened for major universal healthcare during the Nixon administration. After his re-election in 1972, Richard Nixon in 1973 rolled out a universal catastrophic healthcare plan, which was essentially Medicare for all but means tested. If you were poor, if you were in the first couple of quintiles, you're taken care of, government provided health care, but as you move up the income scale, there would be deductibles you'd have to pay before the government would take over. So Charles Koch would not be getting free medical care from the get-go. Maybe he'd have to spend $60,000 or $70,000 before that health care would come into play. But for most people, they would have that health care coverage with very modest deductibles, if anything. That idea, as you remember, Richard Nixon passed a heck of a lot of progressive legislation. This was one of his proposals. The Democrats did not want to go forward with it because they thought, one, they'd be giving Richard Nixon a political win. They didn't want to give him. Two, they thought that they would tackle this issue after Nixon was out of office and pass something even better and more comprehensive. And so the window was missed. Well, the window opens again in 1976, the election of Jimmy Carter, massive Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, and health care immediately gets put back into play. But health care advocates had not been able to unify around one particular approach. So there was an internal war within the Democratic Party between a plan that Jimmy Carter was trying to move, which was somewhat more moderate, and a somewhat more ambitious plan that Ted Kennedy was trying to forward. Of course, he had his eye on the White House, and there was that animating consideration of the fight. But the point was, healthcare analysts had not really unified around what the play would be. There was too much disagreement. It was being put together kind of quickly and on the fly. And before you know it, 1978's elections occurs. Republicans score really big, put about almost a dozen new Republicans in the Senate. And the window closes because everyone begins to panic at what's coming. And they were right to panic because 1980 came and Ronald Reagan. So 2 windows of opportunity had opened. Twice, healthcare advocates were not prepared to take advantage of them. And another window did not open from 1978 until 1992 with the election of Bill Clinton. So the Democrats had been in the wilderness for 14 years. And had they come up with a health care proposal that had been vetted, tested with other actors, the legislative architecture worked out, politicians made comfortable with the considerations? No. For 14 years, I don't know what was going on, but they tended to be asleep. And so Bill Clinton becomes president. There's a demand for health care reform. They've got nothing on the shelf, and they try to put it together on the fly under Hillary Clinton, which you cannot do with complicated legislation because, well, it's complicated. There's a lot of actors that need to have buy-off. There are a lot of tricky political considerations, that these are iterative processes that cannot be done on hyperspeed. And because of that, a window of opportunity was once again lost. Now remember, each time I've told you about this, window of opportunity lasted 2 years before it shut again. And so the 1994 midterm brought us Newt Gingrich. That shut that door again. The window does not open again until Barack Obama. This time, however, things were different because the Affordable Care Act was an iteration of what Mitt Romney had done as governor in Massachusetts, which was built by the Heritage Foundation, oddly enough, as the counter-response to Hillary Care in 1993. But the healthcare community had kind of rallied around the idea that while it's not a perfect vehicle, it is a politically tested and vetted vehicle, and that has the best chance of getting through the Congress. And a template was already there, it had been worked out, and we went through that window. I don't mean to go on and on about this, but the point I'm trying to make is that the time that you spend in the political wilderness is not the time for empty speech making, posing, or internal consumption politics. It is a time where you have to you have to get ideas into play, legislative architecture written, put into the conversation. You need to make political actors comfortable with what you're moving. It's an iterative process that takes time. We're not doing that on the climate front today. If you ask people in Washington, what's the play if the Democrats get the White House, nobody really knows. Is it going to be cap and trade again? Is it going to be some sort of watered-down Green New Deal? Is it going to be a carbon tax? Is it going to be industry-specific regulatory initiatives? It's unclear. Is there any legislation that's moving through the Congress that allows us to put together the architecture and see if we can get some sort of agreement? No. None of that is happening. And one of the problems that I had with the Green New Deal is that those who were trying to move in that direction were being jihaded by sunrise activists in a totally counterproductive fashion. I mean, we know about what happened with the resolution with Senator Feinstein, because it got a lot of attention. But what's less known is they went after Sheldon Whitehouse in exactly the same fashion. And you can find that on YouTube as well. In what upside-down Alice in Wonderland wilderness is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island an enemy of climate action? Somebody who should be shamed through YouTube videos about not acting aggressively. It'd be all well and good to say, as was mentioned earlier, that, you know, as Emily mentioned, well, you know, these aren't exclusive, you know, you do you, I'll do me, you can, you know, that's all well and good as long as one side allows the other to have some oxygen as well. But that's not what had been going on in the Green New Deal. Anybody was not willing to sign on to universal health care, a guarantee of job, guarantee income, the whole panoply of the Democratic Socialists of America that's wrapped into that bill got attacked by sunrise activists, which seems insane to me. Now, one thing that it's important to keep in mind is that in political science, we know that it does take some bipartisan support to pass anything. Political scientists named James Curry and Francis Lee recently published a paper which looked at all the significant policy change exercises from the mid-1970s to the present. In other words, in each Congress, when they open, there is usually a clear blueprint for what are the key legislative initiatives that that particular majority in Congress is trying to produce. And they went back to look at the success rate of passage for these key legislative initiatives. And they found that only 4% of the time did important legislative initiatives pass without the majority support of the minority party. 4% of the time. That's a total of 11 incidences in about 40 years. 10 of those 11 occurred with veto-proof majorities, filibuster-proof majorities in the Senate, which no matter how optimistic you are about November 2020 is not going to happen. Now, that is an extremely difficult lift. I understand why people who are climate activists and people on the left think of the prospect of moving that much Republican support behind climate action as deeply problematic, the very definition of a heavy lift. And that's true. I doubt we're going to get majority Republican support in the next Congress for something. But you're going to need some Republican support. People forget the last time the Waxman-Markey went through the Senate. What sank it was not that Lindsey Graham and John McCain said, check, please. They did. 12 Democrats said, check, please. Just to remind you, the Democrats had 60 votes in the Senate, and then after Brown's election in Massachusetts, 59. So even without McCain and Lindsey Graham, they could have made it close on a filibuster vote, could have got there earlier. But 12 Democrats walked away, including liberals like Al Franken. So if you think that Manchin and Tester and if Hickenlooper gets elected in Colorado and Bennett is going to vote for anything remotely like the Green New Deal in the next Congress, then you're drinking something better than what was in my hotel bar last night. Now, the counter to all of this, and I'll wrap it up here, was the observation that Leah makes about, well, but this is really popular. I don't care. It's not relevant. We're talking about passing legislation, not winning polling contests. Because one thing that people outside of political scientists don't really appreciate, I know Leah does, is that there is virtually no, and I'm being generous when I say virtually, because the reality is there is no correlation between public opinion and policy change. None, zero, nada, doesn't exist. So the fact that more people might support climate action is neither here nor there to whether legislation is more advantaged on the Hill because of that increased support. It is utterly irrelevant. If you want a progressive voice to tell you that, check out Marty Gilens from Princeton University. He's written several books on the topic. I don't agree with him about why that discrepancy is there, but the fact that there is no correlation is most certainly true. Other research by Matt Grossman at Michigan State University likewise puts a hammer to this. So the key consideration is what can pass. And that is where I think the Green New Deal fails. At least it fails as part of the conversation in the near term, which is why we need to move beyond it and do the heavy lifting necessary to be able to take advantage of this next window, because climate activists are right. We don't have indefinite amount of time. Carbon budgets are constrained. We only have about a dozen years to take the kind of meaningful actions we need to take if we are going to reduce the chances for extreme climate shock. So we don't have the luxury of missing this window. We don't know when the next window is going to open. We don't have 14 years to check in again, and we don't have the ability to unilaterally force it open. So what I'm asking for is climate activists to be serious. Politics is not an internal consumption good. It is the art of the possible. It is not the exhortation for the impossible. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. I just wanted to ask, so it sounds like you say that you believe that the Green New Deal has sucked the air out of the room in terms of conversations about what can actually be passed on climate change in Congress now. What can actually be passed? So where do you think the conversation would be among Democrats and the very few Republicans who are in the conversations if it had not been for the Green New Deal? And the same question for Leah, because I think that I've seen a complete change in the conversation about what should be considered than the scale of solutions that should be considered since the Green New Deal came out, the blueprint, that is. Have you seen that as well? And so what do you think is achievable in the near term? Well, and do you think the Green New Deal has served a purpose?
So there's a number of different issues there. I'll try to run through them quickly. What could pass in this particular Congress at best is probably a major increase in research and development, something like what Senator Lamar Alexander is talking about. Optimistically, that might mean a doubling of how much we're spending on R&D. I think that is the outer limit of what is passable in this particular Congress. And that's not nothing. I mean, it's by no means sufficient. It's inadequate to the challenge, but it is a positive step that would be part of any meaningful, ambitious policy action, would be a major increase in R&D, though I'd like it to be research and development, demonstration and deployment, RD, D&D. That's probably a little bit too far for Republicans. I think that's passable in this Congress, but it's not particularly likely. Alexander and other Republicans have floated this doubling or major increase in R&D for several Congresses now, and it's basically kind of signaling they don't really put a lot of energy into it, so we'll see. Has the Green New Deal improved the conversation or made these things more likely? It has certainly added a context where Republicans feel they have to say something, if not the Green New Deal, then what? But I'm not entirely sure the Green New Deal is exclusively responsible for that. Remember, the Republicans just got shellacked in the 2018 midterms in suburban areas, largely by educated white women. And if you look at the polling data, you find climate change was maybe not a decisive matter in their vote. It's not a decisive matter in anyone's vote. But it's what I call the mosaic of crazy that colors the GOP. Gun fetishism, climate change denialism, the evangelical extremism out of the party. None of these things are in and of themselves enough to drive Republican suburban voters away from the party. But when you put them all together and you look at the party through that lens, it is deeply, deeply problematic. That also had a role for why Matt Gaetz, for instance, is now taking point for Republicans on climate action, even though he is the Trumpiest of the Trump Republicans. I don't think it had a lot to do with the Green New Deal. I think it had a lot to do with what's going on in Florida with Republican votes, because that's truly a frontline community. And it's also because of the fact that he needs to have these votes down the road, and he's looking to pick them up. As far as whether the Green New Deal is sucking up the oxygen in the room, I felt it was doing that when I wrote my 11,000-word encyclical. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think one of the things that's been kind of remarkable this summer is how quickly the Green New Deal has become a secondary and tertiary political consideration. No longer, if you're a Democrat like Pete Buttigieg, are you going to talk about climate change and worry about suicide bombers from the Sunrise Movement disrupting your events because you're not signing on to the Green New Deal. In the House now, we've had a resolution which was aspirational and as relatively vague as one can imagine, and there has been absolutely no movement in putting legislative bones around that. I know there are people engaged in that, one of whom unfortunately isn't here today, as I had hoped, but nothing's in play yet. And until something's in play, I think the political world has moved on. So the New Democrats are looking at drafting something, other political actors are, bills are being produced. So it's less of an obstacle now than it had been, which I think is a relatively positive thing.
Well, I agree with Jerry on a lot of things, but I really don't agree with you on social movements. And I would encourage you and others to read the history of social movements, because if you look at the Earth Day movement, the founding of the EPA, the Clean Air Act, a lot of the landmark environmental legislation that we still rely on today for things like the Clean Power Plan actually came out of a big public outpouring of people in the streets. And I think that, like, I know Friday was only like yesterday, but wow, I mean, that was around the world. And it was young people, it was Sunrise, and it was also teenagers. I was at the strike in New York. And I just think we cannot dismiss that outright. Of course, strikes and social movements were also really important to the original New Deal. And so I get Jerry's points about Sunrise being disruptive, but I actually think that's their role in an ecosystem, and that they are playing that role effectively. And they have certainly moved the Democratic primary to take far more ambitious timelines. I mean, if you look at the 2030 and 2035 figures that I showed, like, nobody else has made those figures because nobody was talking about 2030 or 2035. Like, in my book, it was all 2050, and only Biden is saying that now. And so I think that their moral clarity of young people is really powerful, and I hope and think that that could also develop on the right. And there's some movements towards that, like when the young people last week on Thursday were in Congress giving testimony, they also had a Republican youth there too. So, and I think you can see that. So your critique about public opinion never mattering, it's really funny. That's more of a debate in political science than you would think. I'd come down more on your side. But there are people who really do think it matters. And the nice example that you can really see is actually on gay rights most recently, where you saw a really big surge in public opinion, and then you saw a big surge in laws. And I'm hopeful that climate can follow that kind of a pattern, where we get people in the streets, we activate people, And personally, I don't feel bad about Feinstein or White House being bird-dogged. I'm not saying that I think they're bad politicians. I don't. I like them a lot. But I'm not in the Sunrise movement, so that's not my job. But I think Sunrise doing these bird-dogging actions, working on primaries, will bring some of the Democrats who, like you said, wouldn't even pass Waxman-Markey further towards climate action. And that doesn't have to be further towards the left. I think ultimately you might be right that packaging a broader deal would be harder. But a lot of your critiques, Jerry, really speak to the inside Congress game. And I think you're like spot on that. But there's another element, which is the outside expansion of the scope of conflict. And that is what the environmental movement is trying to do. Whether or not they can pull it off, I don't think we know yet. But I got to tell you, I felt pretty damn heartened by Friday. And I know that that is just going to continue.
The problem, I mean, I don't want to go on with this, but the blocking agent in climate politics right now is the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. A decade ago, I think you can make a pretty strong case that it was low salience in the Democratic Party as well, which is why people like Al Franken, who I otherwise liked a lot, would say check please on Waxman-Markey. Mm-hmm. I don't think that would happen today. I think Manchin might, and Tester might, and Sherrod Brown might if the AFL-CIO was against it. So I don't think there's by any means a lock that the Democrats, even if they get the Senate, would have the numbers, even if there were no filibuster issue in play, to pass something ambitious. That's still unclear. But it's less problematic today than it was yesterday. The big problem is Republican intransigence. So every single story I hear about external pressure being applied on Congress to act is going to have to be a story about external pressure being applied to Republicans for them to act. I don't care how many people Greta puts in New York, it's not changing James Inhofe's vote. Nor is it going to change the vote of most Republicans. For a few people in the House, it might, because there are a lot more Republicans who are in swing districts and purple districts and suburbia, where these things might matter. But let me tell you a little story. I won't use the congressperson's name, but in the last Congress, I remember talking to a congressperson, a Republican, who was privately supportive of climate action, and was leaning towards signing on somehow publicly to a carbon pricing bill. Ultimately, this congressperson never did so. And the conversation I had with this member was, look, first, there's no window of opportunity for us to act. So why should I put my name on this? All I do is draw a big target on my back for Koch and conservatives who might challenge me in a primary. Secondly, even if I please the environmental movement and sign on to an ambitious carbon tax bill, or at least signal my approval in public for carbon pricing, what do I gain? Do I gain those activists in my re-election campaign? No. Virtually every single climate activist in my district is also mad at me because of my vote on health care. They're mad at me because I voted for Paul Ryan to be Speaker of the House. They're mad at me because I'm not signing on to #resist on Donald Trump on a million different grounds. I can't get them. Climate actors are pretty anchored to the progressive left. They're not up for grabs. They're just not there. And besides that, I'm going to be outbid by the Democrat no matter what I support. If I say I'm in favor of a $50 carbon tax, they'll be in favor of a $100 carbon. So I can't win the bidding war. So there's no political capital I gain. So if you're going to tell me a story about, activism and marching in the streets moving Republican votes, I need to hear a story about exactly why it's going to move them. And you ain't moving them if they represent Coons Hollow, Alabama. They don't care what's happening in Chicago in demonstrations and marches. And as far as the millennial vote is concerned, there's a great book by Rouse and Ross, Politics of Millennials, you may have seen. I don't mean to go on about this, but it's really fascinating. It turns out, yeah, millennials are way more interested in climate change than older Americans. But it turns out that if you ask them what you should do, it's all lifestyle change stuff. Oh, I should, use Metro or ride a bike or not use plastic straws, or I should be a vegan, or these are things to lower their carbon footprints. That's where they're really, they're very militant. You ask about public policy, they don't look that different from people who are older than they are. So there could be a little bit of fool's gold in the millennials will save us from climate change story.
Leah, can I just ask a quick question responding to that? So does your research show that the other programs in the Green New Deal, aside from the centrally climate-focused ones, appeal to Republicans as well?
Yeah, I didn't show the figure because it's under review at a press embargo journal. But the interesting thing is that so we have to, of course, accept the premise that public opinion matters. And I got to tell you, Jerry, even if it doesn't matter, we can still play a game of constructing public opinion as if it matters, right? Like there's another game.
I really don't want to play that game because
I think it's a very powerful game to be playing. I do. But anyway, what we show is that with these social policies, it doesn't actually reduce support on the right. It's basically just neutral, including it in a package, and it dramatically increases support on the left. That's what the finding is. But I wanted to say something back to Jerry. So look, Jerry, I agree with you, but I think what you're forgetting is like politics can shift pretty dramatically, and I think if you think about the civil rights era, where you had organizing, and you got the Civil Rights Act, you got the Voting Rights Act, you think about the environmental era where we got the EPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, NEPA. You know, that's what the goal is here. And I take your skepticism that that's not where we are now, but Sunrise is a federated social movement. They have chapters throughout the country. They're a very interesting organization in terms of how decentralized they are. And I don't know if they can scale up in terms of funding, in terms of people, but they're the best shot we've ever had. And even if all they do is play an outside game to like an EDF or somebody on the inside, I still think that's powerful because I've studied Texas in the 90s passing an air quality law and an RPS and an efficiency law. And the reason why that got passed was because it was a combination of insider and outsider politics, basically. So personally, I think that, you know, yes, the social movement part of it is not there, and Republicans don't feel threatened at this moment in time. But Nixon didn't want to do a lot of these environmental things either, and eventually he did. And so personally, I feel that I wouldn't write off the social movement lever yet, because I think it can be very powerful.
I think you misunderstand why Nixon did that. I mean, most of the historians of the Nixon administration agree that Nixon's environmentalism and pro-labor, because he was in favor of a universal, before Yang came around, a universal guaranteed income was a Richard Nixon policy. I mean, if he were running today, he'd be considered almost a DSA member of the domestic front. And the people who study the Nixon administration, when they ask, you know, what was going on here? Was he always just a secret agent of the left when it came to economics? No, he saw the anti-war movement and he wanted to grab the attention of higher income, educated whites and repurpose that energy somewhere else. And the environmental movement as it arose in 1970 was like perfect. I mean, in other words, there's only so much time we have for activism. And you almost have like this market. I can be an activist against the war. I can be an activist for the environment. I can be an activist. In other words, where are we going to put our time and resources? And if you look back at the history of this, the anti-war movement was quite hostile to the environment because they saw it as a threat to do exactly that, and to some extent it worked. So the idea that Richard Nixon acted on the environment because of Earth Day and he got coerced into it is a really, really bad narrative. He saw a tactical opportunity here beyond the fact that there was a long-standing Republican tradition of environmental protection that had not yet disappeared under Richard Nixon that he took advantage of. So I think it's too easy to play these stories about social movements or the war movement, or just look at the gay rights movement. It was not the Congress that passed laws legalizing gay marriage. It was the U.S. Supreme Court. To the extent to which politics played out on gay marriage, in 2004, there were resolutions passed in almost a dozen states outlawing gay marriage? I mean, basically, advocates for gay marriage and gay rights were generally losing more than winning until the Supreme Court acted. Now, if we have a story where the Supreme Court can act on climate, maybe, but we're in a legislative arena here.
Well, first of all, the courts are a very critical tool. I totally take your point on that. That's something I argue in my book. And obviously, the Supreme Court is not great on that in this moment in time. But at least at the state level and at the local level, there are very interesting cases playing out. For example, on October 23rd, the New York Attorney General will start its proceedings against Exxon. That's under state law. So there's also these public trust cases.
And we're involved, we're involved in some of those, right?
Yeah, I actually think that like the legal efforts are part of this broader movement. So from my view, this is the three ways you do it. You do it through the public opinion, building either genuine grassroots support or bullshitty ones like astroturfing. You do it through the parties, through primary challenges, AOC being an interesting example of that. And then you do it, and it doesn't work on the right. I totally take your point. So you also got to get enough people excited about this that you massively increase turnout and maybe get rid of some Republicans, no offense. And then you do it through the court system. And I think that that is what the utilities and fossil fuel companies have done so effectively to hold back and roll back environmental policy. And now the left has got to try to figure out how to do that. And the insurgent groups doing that kind of work are groups like Justice Democrats, Data for Progress, Sunrise Movement. You may not share their politics, but they're punching way above their weight given the kinds of budgets that they have, for example. So I don't know. I think that this is another theory of change that's being tried, and I'm a bit more curious to see how it works out, because an inside-only, Waxman-Markey, cost-first carbon tax I don't think is going to work either, because there isn't even a lot of consensus on the left about that right now. And I'm like not the most anti-carbon tax person on the planet. Like I'm really not, actually. But like many people are not. And I got to tell you, when people talk about polluting fees like Kamala Harris's plan or Bernie Sanders, like there's a lack of understanding that that actually hits the consumer. Like they pretend as if it's like I'm just going to punish the polluters. It's like that's going to hit consumers, and that's not going to be popular. So we have to figure out a way to make climate policy popular. At least that's what I think.
Can we just pause for a second here, because
Yeah.
we're about to go to questions, but I feel like we keep coming back to the same point here, which is that policymakers don't respond to public opinion. So if that's true, if that premise is true, what are they responding to? And how do we fix that? Because obviously the scientists say that we need to fix it at a huge scale. The public opinion is trending that way too. What are they listening to, if not the people they're representing?
So there's two different stories here that I think that work together. They're not at odds. A political scientist named Benjamin Bishon points out that majorities generally lose in American politics, minorities win. Why? Because minority preferences are often very well organized, very well mobilized, and they are far more engaged in the political process than the majority. A classic example is the NRA, right? The NRA's policy agenda, if you were to poll it, gets about 12% support. All right? But it doesn't matter. It does not matter that the bulk of the American public is opposed to the NRA's agenda. The NRA will generally beat its opposition every time. Why? Because they have a very weaponized, well-organized activist wing. All right?
And primaries.
So,
primaries.
yeah, and so I don't mean to say or suggest that nothing that happens outside of the corridors of power on Capitol Hill matters. But when I see public opinion surveys marshaled as if I'm supposed to fall to my knees and say, oh, it says here that more Republicans support than oppose the carbon tax, as if that's going to move anybody. I mean, it may be true, but it's utterly irrelevant. What's more relevant are the organized interest groups.
Yeah, that's
so,
true.
And then there's the other second thing, is a political scientist named David Carroll has produced a tremendous amount of very impressive research on this. And what he argues is that politicians are in the business of coalition management. So, in other words, there are, in the Democratic Party, there are important coalitional actors, environmentalists, labor, minorities, the feminist movement, pro-choice, and a few others you can think of. And the Republican side, it's gun nuts, it's evangelicals, it's corporate America, all the politicians in the business are managing those coalitions because those coalitional actors are really important. They have resources that they rely on to wage and win electoral campaigns. And so they're responding to these coalitional actors. They're not responding to, so when someone comes up with a study saying, I think, Leah, you probably did one of these in the past, but I know other people have done them as well, saying, well, politicians don't, they really misunderstand what people in their districts think. They're just really bad at that. Well, believe me, it's not that they're bad at it because they're just kind of like low IQ. It's just they don't really care that much. What they really care about, like how many times I get called, those are activated people. Somebody activated them. Somebody made them do something. You have to pay way more attention to the calls than you do some vague public opinion survey, because it doesn't necessarily weaponize against you.
So this is my area of research, as Jerry talked about. What we show is that chiefs of staff and legislative directors in Congress dramatically underestimate support for climate action, gun control, et cetera. And what we show empirically is that the more they're meeting with the American Petroleum Institute, fossil fuel companies taking money from them as relative to environmental groups like Sierra Club, the worse job they do at guessing what climate support is. And I got to tell you, on that exact same survey, we asked them, what's the most important thing when you decide to, like when you tell your boss how to vote on a bill? And they told us it was public opinion. So now, right, that doesn't bear out in the data, like Jerry is saying. But I think there's still like a myth that's very powerful, which is that we live in a democracy. And so I do feel that giving, Josh Calla and Ethan Porter have done a follow-up where they've tried to give accurate data and politicians won't even look at it. And now I'm doing a follow-up study trying to partner with Congress to look at the actual calls and data to think exactly about what you're saying. So I think actually that like concentrated interest groups capturing the political system and having a guaranteed seat at the table is a huge part of this story, and building a social movement that is broader based, that has different voices in the conversation, will hopefully shift how Congress perceives these things. Because I think Congress actually thinks it cares about public opinion, whether or not it actually does. And so from my perspective, the left or the environmental movement has to play just as much of that kind of game as the right has been much more effective at doing historically. So, yeah.
We need to come to questions here if we can have people queue up. Oh, no, that's great. But can I ask you just to put a fine point on this, and then we'll move straight to a question. What we were talking about earlier, a doubling of research funding.
Oh, I love it.
Well,
let's do it, Jerry.
What effect would that have on the chart that you were showing earlier? And even, let's say, in 5-10 years, what are we talking about? Possibly a carbon tax and dividend, maybe 15 years?
The issue about with R&D, and I love ARPA-E, amazing, the last presentation, super fan. The issue with R&D, which Jigar Shah has influenced my thinking on this, is that like the timelines are not in favor of long-term R&D. Like we actually have to deploy like mad, and that's certainly what the pictures show. But anyway, that does not mean I don't want ARPA-E to have like quadruple the budget, $1 bajillion, like yes. I just want to spend a lot more money because I love the government, it's a bad habit. But yeah, but I want to spend it smart. So for example, I'm not a fan of Bernie Sanders' plan, not because I don't want to spend $16 trillion, but because if you actually dig into how he's spending it, it's like highly problematic from a climate perspective. So, you know, I feel like we can say let's spend money, but let's do it smart. And maybe even let's spend money that Republicans want to spend too. And personally, I do feel that some of this climate debate that Sunrise has pushed has created space for conversations about more R&D spending and more right-wing answers, right? Because just like you're saying, if you're being asked by journalists all the time, like, what's your climate plan? And the Republicans have no answer, they have to come up with something. And I think the things they've come up with are R&D, right? Maybe a carbon tax initially with liability exemptions for fossil fuel companies. Now that's removed. So I don't know. Let's spend money.
So this is I'm Nils Gelman from the Berggruen Institute. So, I mean, this is a classic debate between insider and outsider politics. And I just want to suggest that maybe there's a compromise position. And I think the lessons from the civil rights movement, I think, can be overextended if we think about them for climate politics for a couple of different reasons. First of all, one of the things that was essential, and I think we can learn from the history of the civil rights movement, whether the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century or more recently with respect to gay rights, is there was very concrete, specific, tactical legislation that was on the table, right, in a way that is not just a laundry list of wishes that the left had, right? You know, a lot of the Green New Deal stuff, it was governance by press release, where let's do a Green New Deal, and then, oh, what's the policy actually going to be? We're going to fill that in afterwards. That's not the way to actually achieve things. The civil rights movement had a very robust, specific legislative and judicial strategy, which then was buttressed on the streets.
Yeah.
The second point is that I think that the reason why the civil rights movement was successful is because there were very concentrated winners. I mean, one of the stories about movement politics is you've got to create concentrated winners. The problem with climate politics is it's concentrated losers and diffuse winners. Mm-hmm. And that's a very, very different dynamic politically than the one that obtained with the civil rights movement.
I think you should add one thing to your critique. It was also bipartisan. People forget there was a time when the Republican Party was not the segregationist party of the Deep South. The Democrat, so when we tell stories about how bipartisanship is so critical to get over the status quo, profound status quo bias on the Hill, and all the choke points by which minorities can frustrate majorities, the Civil Rights Act and the various civil rights legislation was a classic example of that. Because historically, it was liberal Democrats work in the ADA, working also with mainstream Republicans who had been trying to support civil rights, and that helped. So in the climate conversation, what's the analogous situation? Well, right now there isn't very much.
Well, look, I'm not going to defend how things went down with the resolution and stuff. That wasn't me, obviously. I'm an academic. But my Green New Deal is the Inslee Plan, to be clear. And I totally take Jerry's critique. This is the thing keeping me up at night right now, being in the wilderness and being in fucking chaos. I don't want that. I want a plan. I think the Inslee Plan and Bracken Hendrick and Sam Ricketts, who wrote that plan, is really an amazing starting point. And that is my Green New Deal. And that is what I plan to work on with other people. And so I think it can be far more specific. And that policy document, if you've read the 220 pages, isn't like a laundry list, but it does talk a lot about concentrated winners, specifically about union transition issues. And I think it's smart in getting at some of these things. So personally, I feel like the conversation has in some ways moved on, but it doesn't, and maybe we never call what we're doing a Green New Deal. Like, I could care less. I just want real action, and I do not feel that a bipartisan, skinny carbon tax is going to solve the problem.
Let's take some more questions.
Hi, I'm Steve Wang. I'm a new climate and energy analyst with Breakthrough. My question is, what if the Sunrise Movement and sort of the popular movement on the left learns to play the insider game and becomes the new NRA? This might, urgency aside, the NRA has been around for a long time. It might take a long time for the Sunrise Movement to learn this. But if special interests are what move the needle in Washington, could you see this happening long term? And yeah, is this a possibility, or is this just science fiction?
I just have to.
We'll take a couple more, right?
Lydia Bean, I have a question about the problem of Democrats not being a national party, which is another difference with the civil rights era. It's like LBJ had a huge Democratic majority behind him. I mean, rise or fall, but depending on elections. But it was just, there was a huge Democratic majority. It was spread across states and areas that we can't even imagine Democrats contesting now, including places like Mississippi, Georgia, for reasons that we don't have to go into here. But what do we do with that when so many climate activists, as you mentioned earlier, Jerry, climate activists marching in Chicago and New York does not mean anything to a lot of the Republicans we're trying to reach out to. So what do you do with that geographic concentration of a lot of climate activism and linked to the geographic contraction of the Democratic Party, which even though the 2018 election did see some gains, just in long-term historical perspective is still a huge change since the civil rights era?
Jane Flegel with the Bernard and Ann Spitzer Charitable Trust. Jerry, this is a question for you. What is it that you think can move Republicans on climate in the relative near term?
Well, first of all, you have to be able to speak their language, Russian, and I make it a practice of getting that joke in at every single public engagement I have, so I hadn't done it yet, so thank you for the opportunity. There's no political window for climate action in this Congress, and you can't kick it open. At best, you may be able to pull an R&D project, as we discussed. In the next Congress, that's what we have to keep in mind. That's our window. If it opens, it'll open in the next Congress. No guarantee it will open, by the way. But if it does open, what can get through before that window shuts? The most ambitious thing that I can think of that is going to draw Republican support is a carbon tax as the centerpiece, maybe not the only piece of the legislation, but as the centerpiece of the legislation. Why? Because it's already been given the good housekeeping seal of approval from ExxonMobil, BP, Royal Dutch Shell, a number of different major oil companies. That's something. If they begin to put some lobbying muscle into this, that will count. There is a raft of libertarian and conservative economists who embrace Pigouvian taxes, including the guy who runs the Mercator Center, Tyler Cowen, who's a good libertarian, and it's a Koch-funded operation, and he supports carbon taxes. There's no shortage of people like that out there. They've got enough political cover to do it, and they actually have policy design. One of the things that I was most encouraged about in the last Congress and this Congress is that meaningful pieces of carbon tax legislation have been coming out of the Republican side that aren't just messaging bills. I mean, they are architecturally tight, well thought out, ready for prime time, and actors who are interested in exactly how this works can vet it right now and say, all right, here's how we're going to deal with border adjustments, and here's how we're going to deal with all the other issues that can get fiendishly complicated in carbon pricing. That's the most ambitious I think Republicans can go. I'm not predicting it, but it's a possibility. And depending upon what you gloss it with, James Inhofe has been asked at least on a half dozen occasions in Politico and elsewhere how he feels about a carbon tax which had trade-offs with regulatory authority. And he said, I'd have to see what the deal looked like. I wouldn't rule it out of hand. When James Inhofe is not going to rule out of hand a carbon tax depending upon what you put around it, it tells you there's a little bit more opportunity there than maybe you think. If you look at Holden Jenkins, another guy who's hard for me to read sometimes on the Wall Street Journal editorial page, it's almost as if he's on a jihad now to promote carbon taxes as the rational alternative to the Green New Deal, even though he is not a friendly when it comes to climate action. So that's the angle that I see playing out with Republicans in the next Congress.
Can we come back to the question as well about special interests? Because I feel like we're talking about different things here. Because I think the special interests that we're talking about that are successful in swaying Congress are industries, not necessarily advocates. And I got corrected recently in another panel that I was moderating about this question specifically. I was talking about environmental advocates, and they said, no, it's the environment industry. Let's talk about it so we can be on level footing. So is there a world in which the Sunrise Movement can have the kind of power that Exxon has?
Yeah, they just have to change what they're doing and do something else. In fact, there was a really good book by Matt Grossman, a political scientist at Michigan State, which looked at written histories of policy change. It was something of a normative process, but he looked at about 790 extended 10-year plus narratives about how, like, the Affordable Care Act got passed, or how the Civil Rights Act got passed, or how the Clean Water Act got passed, or, you know, on and on. 790 case studies in which he found that the most, and based on interviews with staff, histories with the sponsors, the political actors, and he found actually that business is less influential than our activist groups. On Capitol Hill, they tended to have, they were credited more by staff and by legislators with playing a key role than did, say, trade groups like the Chamber of Commerce or NAM or something like that.
But that's like blocking versus passing, right? Because industry can be very effective, for example, in the waxen market.
I'm not saying they're not effective. I'm just, the idea that activist groups that, like, say, EDF, NRDC, the NRA, because they're activist groups, are not relevant. I think that's just wrong. They are very
I agree,
important.
but of course there's like action and non-action, right?
When I said that Sunrise has to do something different, however, is that in these narratives about how policy change occurs, it is almost, as a rule, there are exceptions, but as a rule, it is people in governing networks in Washington working behind the scenes, compromising, and trying to find areas of common ground and building coalitions. It is a cooperative and iterative process of working together with political savvy and good faith. Now, when you go to Sheldon Whitehouse's office, who is your best climate spokesman in the Senate, the Al Gore of our day, and threaten to primary him and make sure that's on YouTube, that's not, you know, productive conversation in the governing networks of Washington.
Yeah, so to go back to some of these Sunrise questions, I don't think that they are the vehicle for the inside game. You usually, so for example, the Texas case that I talked about, which is in my book, is about Public Citizen and EDF, sort of as the inside and the outside parties. And Public Citizen is a grassroots kind of group that is more like Sunrise. And typically these sort of social movement groups are not the ones who end up going and negotiating that bill, and that creates tension. For example, the environmental justice community is often very annoyed that they're not the ones at the table. But often you have this kind of dialectic between groups pushing from the outside and then groups compromising on the inside. And I would say, you know, per your concern about there's no, you know, everything is right wing and da-da-da, like, yeah, politics can shift. You know, the women's marches were the biggest protests in American history. The climate march was the biggest protest in world history. I mean, like, let's just not count ourselves out of the game here yet. We're up against gerrymandering. We're up against a big, massive move to the right. But things are starting to shift. And the goal that Sunrise has, as I mentioned, is a federated group. And Theda Skocpol, a very important sociologist and political scientist, argues a lot that you need federated groups because they have to have ground game across the country working on specific campaigns in specific places. And that is how they're set up. Can they scale? Can they get enough funding to do what they're doing? Can they become the civil rights movement for the environment? I don't know, but they're the best bet that we have. So I hope that they can.
I think we're pretty close on time here. Would either of you like to make a very brief conclusion remark in response to
Neither of
things
us
that you've
are
heard
brief.
from the other? I'll time you.
Okay. You want to
Go ahead, Leah.
30 seconds.
Look, I think Jerry is smart and better dressed than me, so I'm really up against it here. But, you know, we do, totally, Kingdon, policy change, I'm with you. It's a huge issue. We are going to have a shot, and we're going to have a shot, please, in the next Congress, and we need to be ready for that. And I totally take Jerry's critique. I take it seriously that we need to get our ducks in a row. But I am more optimistic that we are capable of doing that, and I want to do that work. And I just deeply fear that doing a bipartisan package that's only a carbon tax will not solve the problem, and I am only in my early 30s, and I really want to solve the problem, just like the youth who were in the street, because I'm going to be alive for a few decades, and I'm deeply fearful of 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, as many of you in the room may also be. And so that is where I come down. It's not ideological. I'm not against economists. I'm not even against Republicans, because you know, I'm Canadian. I don't even have a party ID. So it's just that I actually want to solve the problem. And I feel that a bigger package that can actually sneak little things through, what I call the Fog of Enactment, is a huge part of getting things done. And if you look at the Energy Policy Act of 1992, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, these were really big laws that had little things in them. So personally, I want a big package, not just a little carbon price.
Okay, now I'm going to actually time.
Sorry, Jerry.
I think
Used your time.
We'll make sure
but
you
I gave
get
you
what Leah
compliments,
said.
so we're even.
Your response to the Canadian.
Yeah, I'd like to have ponies too, but the problem is that in the next political window, in the next Congress, it is guaranteed we will not be able to do as much as we need to do on climate. That is a given. The objective is to do as much as the political circumstances allow. If the carbon tax is as much as political circumstances will allow, then we need to support it. We don't want to make the best the enemy of the better, even if you believe other things are preferable here. What I don't want to see is the nationalization of what happened in the state of Washington a couple of years ago with I-732. Because here we had a classic case. You had a conservative running a ballot initiative that had a fighting chance that would have put the most ambitious price on carbon in the United States and arguably in the world. It would have been the most ambitious local endeavor on climate we've ever seen. And it was opposed by the progressive left and the Green New Dealers then, the proto-Green New Dealers, because they said climate change is everything policy. It's not just climate policy. It has to have, you know, jobs and equity issues and all these things, and it was divorced from all that. And they joined with Koch and they joined with the oil industry to oppose that initiative, and they beat I-732. Now, this is the kind of political madness that has migrated out of Washington that I saw earlier last year in the Green New Deal movement. And that is not, you know, that's not idealism as much as it is performance art politics. And it's not getting us anywhere, and this issue is too important to continually miss because of self-indulgence.
Well, just to be clear, that isn't actually, you know, that isn't actually my position, right? Like, I am very happy and willing to put nuclear or direct air capture or R&D or carbon taxes in whatever bill. And I say that in rooms of Green New Dealers.
I understand. So I am offering my critique to the mythological Green New Deal proponent who
it's like the hipster. You can never find one or whatever. Yes.
All right.
On that note, thank you both so much.
Thank you.